My son left me in the woods on a freezing winter night, 45 miles from home, just because I refused to sign over the entire farm. The woods have a way of making old men think more clearly, Dad. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just stood there and watched him drive away. About 30 minutes later, a car pulled up. The person who stepped out was calm and ready. I smiled as I got into the car. He thought that night was a lesson for me, but he had no idea he was the one about to face the consequences. I'm really glad you're here. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city or country. It helps build this community. Please note, this story includes fictional elements for storytelling and reflection. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message behind it is meant to stay with you. The restaurant lights disappeared somewhere around mile 3. I noticed it the way I used to notice things in the courtroom, quietly, without turning my head, filing the observation somewhere useful. The road had shifted from the familiar 2-lane stretch past Miller's Hardware and the old post office to something narrower, something that curled north toward the pine country. Calvin hadn't said a word since we left the steakhouse. He drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, jaw set in that particular way he had when he'd already made a decision and didn't want to discuss it. I let him drive. 30 years on the bench in Madison County taught me that silence is rarely empty. It carries weight. It carries intention. I sat in the passenger seat of my son's car and I listened to the silence between us the way I used to listen to witnesses who thought they were saying nothing. The trees came up on both sides around mile 12. Longleaf pines, old ones, the kind that have been standing since before either of us was born. Their tops disappeared into the December dark. No moon that night, just a sky full of cloud cover and the pale wash of the headlights cutting through the cold. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s. I could feel it at the window seal where a thin draft came through. Calvin still hadn't spoken. I thought about asking where we were going. I decided against it. He pulled off the main road onto a gravel track around mile 18-1, of those old Forestry Service roads that the county stopped maintaining sometime in the 90s. The truck bounced over ruts and packed earth. Branches scraped the side mirror. We went another quarter mile before he stopped, cut the engine, and sat in the sudden quiet with his hands still on the steering wheel. The woods were absolutely still. "Dad," Calvin said. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a manila envelope. He set it on the dashboard between us. "I need you to sign these tonight." I didn't reach for the envelope. "What's in it?" I asked. "The transfer documents, the farm, the accounts." He said it the way someone reads off a grocery list. "It's the right move, Dad. You know you can't manage all of it on your own anymore. Serena and we've got a plan. We can—" "No," I said. The words sat between us as clearly as the envelope did. Calvin turned to look at me for the first time since we'd left the restaurant. In the dim light, I could see the shape of his face, Eleanor's jaw, my forehead, a combination I had once considered nothing short of miraculous. He looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he's already calculated and doesn't understand why the numbers aren't cooperating. "Dad," I said. "No, Calvin." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked back out through the windshield at the dark between the trees. He nodded once slowly, like he was agreeing to something I hadn't said. "All right," he said. "All right then." He started the engine. I thought he was turning the truck around. Instead, he put it in drive, and I realized after a moment that he had done the calculation before we ever left the parking lot of that steakhouse. The stopping place, the envelope, the words he'd prepared, and this too. This part he'd decided in advance. He came to a stop, leaned across me, and opened my door. The cold air came in all at once. "You need to think more clearly," he said. "Maybe a little time out here will help." I looked at him. He didn't look back at me. I stepped out of the truck. My boots found gravel, then frozen ground. I stood straight the way I had always stood, and I closed the door behind me with the same deliberate, unhurried motion I used when I closed the door to courtroom B after 30 years of decisions. Calvin pulled away without his reverse lights ever coming on. He'd left in the direction we came from. Within 30 seconds, there was nothing. No taillights, no engine sound, just the wind moving through the tops of those old longleaf pines and the cold pressing in from every direction. I was 45 miles from home. I reached down and touched the face of the watch on my left wrist. An old watch, a Bulova, my wife Eleanor had given me on our 30th anniversary. The crystal was scratched. The band had been replaced twice. I had never once considered replacing the watch itself. I pressed my thumb against the worn edge of the case, felt the small ridge of metal where the back plate met the body, and I allowed myself one quiet smile in the dark. Then I found a pine tree with a wide enough base, brushed the dead needles from a root, and sat down to wait. My name is Thomas Hargrove. I am 67 years old. For 3 decades, I served as a circuit judge in Madison County, North Carolina, the same county where my grandfather broke ground on 400 acres of red clay and longleaf pine that my family has farmed, leased, and held on to through floods market crashes, and 2 generations of lawyers telling us we'd be better off selling. After Eleanor passed in the spring of 2022, I rattled around that farmhouse alone. 4 bedrooms, 2 parlors, a kitchen that still smelled like the herbs she dried over the window. The land was worth more than $2.5 million by the county assessor's last estimate. The savings account she and I had built together over 40 years held another $620,000. I had a modest pension, no debt, and more memories than I knew how to organize. I also had a son I loved more than I knew how to say out loud. That farmhouse, after Eleanor was gone, had a specific kind of quiet in it that had nothing to do with noise. You can fill a house with furniture, with photographs, with the radio on in the kitchen, and it can still be hollowed out in the places that mattered. I learned that the hard way in the months after her funeral. I learned to move carefully through those rooms, to carry my coffee to the porch and watch the fields instead of sitting at the kitchen table where her chair faced mine. I prayed in my own quiet way for something to change. And then Calvin called. He said he wanted to come home. He said he and Serena were ready to settle down, that the city had worn them out, that he wanted to be near the land again. He said he wanted to take care of me. I believed him. I thought it was the answer to every prayer I had ever whispered to Eleanor's empty chair. I still have the drawing. I had it with me that night in the woods, folded twice, tucked into the inside pocket of my coat, right against my chest. A piece of yellowed notebook paper, the kind with the wide blue lines that elementary schools used to hand out by the ream. Calvin drew it when he was 8 years old, sometime in the fall of 1991, and he gave it to me on a Tuesday morning before I left for the courthouse. I remember because Tuesdays were always the longest days on the docket. He'd used a red crayon for my robe and a blue one for his shirt, and the 2 figures were holding hands in the way that children draw hands, oversized circles attached to straight-line arms. Above our heads, in the careful capital letters of a 2nd grader, he had written, "Me and Dad, just as heroes." I kept it in my desk drawer for 23 years. Some mornings when a case was going badly or the weight of a decision sat heavier than usual, I would open that drawer and look at it for a moment. Not long, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be someone's idea of a hero. By the time Calvin was 16, he had graduated from crayon drawings to sitting in the back row of my courtroom on afternoons when school let out early. He would take notes in a spiral notebook, actual notes, not the distracted doodling of a teenager killing time. Once, after a particularly difficult sentencing, I found him waiting by my car in the parking lot. "I want to be like you someday," he said. Not the way kids say things to get a reaction. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying around for a while. Someone people can trust when things go wrong. I put my hand on his shoulder, and I told him that was the finest thing anyone had ever said to me. I meant it then. I mean, it's still, even now, even after everything. Calvin enrolled in law school in the fall of 2004. He went to a mid-tier program in Charlotte, which was fine. I hadn't gone to a prestigious school either. And I believed then, as I believe now, that what a person does with an education matters more than where they received it. He graduated in 2008 with grades that were adequate and a degree that was legitimate, and a handshake I was genuinely proud to give him. What followed was harder to watch. The job market that year was brutal for new attorneys. Calvin applied to firms across the state and got interviews at several, but nothing materialized into an offer that lasted. He clerked for a small practice in Asheville, left after 8 months, over a disagreement I never fully understood. tried to start his own solo practice in 2011, and quietly dissolved it by 2013 when the clients didn't come in the numbers he'd needed. He didn't call much during those years. When he did, his voice had a tightness in it that I recognized the same tightness I had heard in the voices of men sitting across from me in courtrooms. Men who had made a series of small wrong choices and were now arriving at a large wrong consequence. By 2015, I learned from a mutual contact in Charlotte that Calvin had been spending considerable time at private card rooms, the kind that operated in the gray space between legal and illegal in North Carolina at the time, the kind where the stakes started manageable and climbed fast for people with the wrong temperament. Calvin apparently had exactly the wrong temperament. I confronted him about it the Thanksgiving. He denied it initially, then minimized it, then grew angry in the way people grow angry when the truth is closer than they want it to be. We spent that holiday weekend in a silence that felt nothing like the comfortable quiet of the farm and everything like something breaking. Over the following years, the debts accumulated. By the time Calvin came back into my life in any meaningful way, the figure which I would only learn in full much later had reached $340,000. That was when Serena entered the picture, my daughter-in-law. Serena Hargrove, 37 years old, formerly employed at a regional banking institution in Charlotte. A woman with a precise way of speaking and an equally precise way of listening that I initially took for attentiveness. She and Calvin had been together for several years before they married in 2019. I attended the wedding. I smiled in the photographs. I gave a toast. I thought she steadied him. I thought she was the person who had finally given Calvin something worth being responsible for. Looking back now, I understand that I was reading the situation the way a tired man reads, looking for the parts that confirmed what he needed to believe. Serena didn't pull Calvin away from his troubles. She was, as I would later come to understand, a navigator, someone who saw the shape of a problem and identified the fastest route through it, regardless of who or what stood in the way. Calvin had the debt. Calvin had the name, and I had the land. They arrived on an April afternoon in 2023, their SUV loaded with luggage and what appeared to be a genuine enthusiasm for the farm. Serena carried flowers in from the car, wildflowers, the kind you buy at the roadside, stands along Route 26. Calvin walked the fence line with me before dinner and talked about the cattle, about the south pasture, about whether the old equipment barn needed a new roof. It felt, God help me, like a homecoming. I was lonely. I will say that plainly because it is the truth and because I think it matters. Eleanor had been gone for just over a year, and the farmhouse, for all its familiar weight, had developed a specific gravity in the evenings that pressed down on a person. Having voices in the hallways again, having someone to sit across from at the kitchen table, I let that comfort do too much of the work of discernment that I should have been doing myself. 3 weeks after they moved in, Calvin came to me with a proposal. He laid it out at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, the paperwork already prepared. He said he wanted to take over the day-to-day management of the farm accounts and the household expenses just temporarily, just to relieve me of the administrative burden. He framed it as a kindness. He framed it as a son taking care of his father. I thought about it for 2 days. I talked to no one, which was my first mistake. On the third day, I signed a temporary financial power of attorney, granting Calvin authority over the primary farm accounts. That signature, the one I gave away too easily. In a quiet kitchen on a Sunday morning, while Serena made coffee at the counter, and the April light came through the window, would become the first brick in the wall they were building around me. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Not any single call in particular. It was more like a weather pattern, shifting the kind of gradual change you don't register, until one morning you realize the air feels different. June came in warm that year, warm and dry, and somewhere in the middle of it, I understood that the phone on the kitchen counter had stopped ringing the way it used to. Frank Delgado, a retired surveyor I'd known since our boys played Little League together in the early 90s, had called every 3 weeks or so for years. We didn't have long conversations. We talked about the weather, the county commission, whether the diner on Route 26 had gotten better or worse since it changed ownership. The calls had stopped. I told myself he was busy with his grandchildren for the summer. Reverend Harris from the Madison County Community Center had called twice in the spring about the literacy board I'd served on for 8 years. I hadn't heard from him in 6 weeks. I told myself the summer program had his full attention. My neighbor to the north, Gerald Webb, and I had a long-standing arrangement to share equipment during hay season. He hadn't come by, hadn't called. I told myself he'd gotten his own baler fixed. That was the version of events I was running in June of 2023. A series of reasonable explanations stacked one on top of another until they formed something that looked from a certain angle like the truth. I began to pay closer attention in July. What I noticed wasn't dramatic. Serena had a gift for making things appear entirely natural. When Frank called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was out walking the south fence line, she told him I was resting and that she'd pass along the message. She was pleasant about it. I later confirmed that from Frank himself, much later. Friendly even. The kind of friendly that made a person feel it would be rude to press further. The message, of course, was never passed along. The internet service had what Serena described as connection issues, with a frequency that seemed remarkable for a rural area that had managed reliable service for the better part of 4 years. It always happened at specific moments when I sat down at the desk in the study in the evenings to correspond with people, or when I had mentioned earlier in the day that I intended to call someone. The router would be reset by morning. Calvin would shrug and say the service out here had always been spotty. I am a man who spent 30 years evaluating the credibility of testimony. I know the difference between coincidence and pattern. What I did not know in those weeks was what to do with what I was seeing, because every piece of it could be explained away individually, and because the alternative, the conclusion that my own son and daughter-in-law were deliberately walling me off from the people in my life, was a conclusion I was not yet ready to hold. So I talked myself out of it, which I now understand was exactly what they were counting on. Dorothy came on a Saturday in mid-July. My younger sister is 63 years old, a retired school teacher from Boone, who has strong opinions about pie crust county politics and the proper way to stake tomatoes. She drove 2 hours to bring me an apple pie and to sit on the porch and drink sweet tea and talk the way we had talked for 6 decades. I heard her truck on the gravel drive and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tight. We had a good afternoon. We talked about Eleanor. We talked about the farm. Dorothy walked with me to the old equipment barn and looked at the roof and confirmed what I had already suspected it needed attention before winter. She stayed for dinner. Serena was pleasant throughout, attentive, refilling glasses, asking questions about Boone. Calvin talked with Dorothy about the south pasture. It seemed for those few hours entirely normal. 2 days later, Serena came to me in the study. She sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression arranged into something that I can only describe as carefully sorrowful. She said she didn't want to cause trouble. She said she almost hadn't come to me at all. She said she had overheard Dorothy during those few minutes, when the two of them had been alone in the kitchen after dinner, saying something that had concerned her. Something about speaking to an attorney about Thomas's capacity to manage his affairs, about whether the farm might need a legal trustee appointed. Serena said she wasn't judging Dorothy. She understood that Dorothy loved me. She simply felt that I deserved to know. Then she left me alone with it. I have cross-examined witnesses who had more integrity than that conversation deserved. But I was not in a courtroom. I was in my own study on an evening in late July, and the person sitting across from me was my daughter-in-law, who had come to me, or so it appeared, out of genuine concern. I did not stop to ask myself whether what she described was plausible, whether Dorothy had any reason to take such a step without speaking to me first, whether the story had the particular seamless quality of something that had been constructed rather than observed. I picked up the phone and called Dorothy. The conversation was not good. I was sharper than I should have been, and Dorothy, who does not accept that tone from anyone, least of all her older brother, pushed back immediately. She denied saying any such thing. She was angry in the way that people are angry when they've been genuinely wronged, which is different from the anger of people who've been caught. I knew the difference. I had seen both hundreds of times. I chose not to apply that knowledge to my sister. 3 days later, Dorothy drove back to the farm. She knocked for several minutes. She called my name through the front door. I stood in the hallway and listened to her knock and could not make myself open it. Because opening it meant admitting that I had been wrong and foolish, and that the person I was becoming frightened me. She left without a word. I watched her truck move down the long gravel drive that Eleanor had lined with river stones the summer of 2006. Dorothy didn't look back. Not once. And for the first time since Eleanor had passed, I felt completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with an empty house. The bank statement arrived on a Tuesday. I almost missed it. Serena had taken over sorting the mail, another one of those arrangements that had developed gradually framed as a convenience that I had accepted without examining closely enough. But that particular Tuesday, she had a dentist appointment in town, and Calvin was out on the south pasture. And when I came through the front door from my morning walk, I found the stack of envelopes on the hall table where the mail carrier always left them when no one answered the door. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the statement the way I had always opened documents that required my full attention, slowly without prejudice, reading each line before moving to the next. The transfer was on the second page. $8,000 moved on the 14th of July to an account number I did not recognize, listed under a routing code that meant nothing to me. The notation beside it read, Asset Management Services, Q2 fee. I read it 3 times. Then I folded the statement, put it in the inside pocket of my work jacket, and went out to the barn to finish a repair I'd been meaning to get to all week. I waited until dinner. 30 years on the bench taught me many things. But perhaps the most useful was this. The manner in which a person responds to an unexpected question tells you more than the content of their answer. The content can be prepared. The manner for most people cannot not entirely. I set my fork down about halfway through the meal and mentioned in a tone that I kept deliberately conversational that I'd noticed an item on the bank statement. $8,000. An asset management fee. I said I didn't recall authorizing that specific disbursement. Calvin looked up from his plate. Something crossed his face, not guilt exactly, but a kind of rapid calculation, the look of a man running through options in the space of a second. Then his expression settled into something that I would describe as controlled impatience. He explained briefly and without warmth that the payment was for the quarterly oversight fee charged by the property management consultant he had engaged on the farm's behalf. He said it was standard. He said he'd mentioned it. He said these were the kinds of operational details that I had asked him to handle so that I wouldn't have to think about them. Then he asked Serena how the dentist appointment had gone. The subject was closed, not by my choosing. In the courtroom, when a witness changes the subject, you note it. You don't necessarily pursue it in that moment. Experience teaches you that pressing too early collapses an angle you might need intact later. But you note it and you file it and you return to it at the time of your own choosing. I excused myself after dinner and went to the study. On the third shelf of the bookcase behind the desk, behind a volume of North Carolina procedural law that had been there since before Calvin was born, I found what I was looking for, a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, the same kind I had used for case notes throughout most of my time on the bench. I had kept a supply of them out of habit, 4 or 5, on that shelf untouched for 3 years. I opened one to the first page and I began to write. Date July 18th, 2023. Item $8,000 transferred from primary farm account notation, Asset Management Services, Q2 fee. No prior authorization from account holder. Explanation offered Calvin Hargrove verbal at dinner. Tone clipped dismissive. Subject change immediate. Second item correspondence volume from outside contacts has decreased markedly since April. Frank Delgado, last contact unknown. Reverend Harris, last contact 6 weeks prior. Gerald Webb, no contact since hay season began. I kept writing. I wrote for an hour, and what emerged on those pages was not a list of grievances, but something closer to a pattern, the kind of pattern I had spent 3 decades learning to recognize. Individual incidents, each one explainable on its own terms. Together, they describe something deliberate. The isolation of Dorothy, the mail sorted by someone else's hands, the internet that failed at convenient moments, a financial authorization I had signed without adequate scrutiny, and now a transfer of $8,000 to an account I could not identify, explained away in 2 sentences, and then buried under a question about dental work. I sat back in the desk chair and looked at what I had written. A man will sometimes resist a conclusion, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the conclusion is one he does not want to reach. I understood that about myself clearly enough to write it down on the last line of that first page. You are not imagining this. Do not talk yourself out of what you are seeing. I left the notebook in the same place behind the same volume of law. Then I put on my boots and my old canvas work coat, and I went out through the back of the house toward the equipment yard, the way I might on any evening when I wanted to check on something before dark. The woodworking shop sat at the far end of the equipment yard, a low building my father had put up in the 1960s, the kind of structure that accumulates tools and lumber and decades of intention. I had spent considerable time in that shop during the year after Eleanor passed, turning wood on the lathe building, nothing in particular, simply keeping my hands occupied while my mind found its way through grief. Behind the workbench, beneath a stack of rough-cut white oak boards that I had been meaning to mill for 2 summers, there was a flat box. Inside the box was a cell phone, one of the old flip-style models, the kind that predated the devices Calvin and Serena carried. Bought years ago, as a backup when the landline went out during ice storms. I had put it there without any particular plan sometime in the weeks after the pattern first began to form. Not a decision, exactly more like an instinct. I opened the phone. The battery was still carrying a charge. I stood in the wood shop with the smell of sawdust and old motor oil around me, and I found the number I was looking for in the saved contacts. George Pittman, 69 years old. A man I had known for 40 years since the early days of my career, when George had been running a private investigations practice out of an office above the hardware store on Main Street in Marshall. We had worked in parallel for years, his side and mine, and somewhere in that working relationship, a friendship had grown that had outlasted both his practice and my bench. George had been one of the 8 people at Eleanor's funeral who had stayed until the end without being asked. I had not spoken to him in 4 months. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear and listened to it ring. George picked up on the second ring. He said my name, just my name, nothing else. The way old friends answer when they see a number they recognize, and something in my chest released for the first time since Eleanor had gone. Not the grief, not the months of what had been building in that house, just the tight, careful watchfulness that I had been holding without realizing how much it weighed. George, I said, I need to talk to you about something. I should tell you about George Pittman. We met in the fall of 1988, across opposite sides of a land fraud case that had been working its way through Madison County for the better part of 2 years. George was operating as a private investigator, retained by the family on one side of the dispute. I was the newly appointed circuit judge assigned to hear it. Technically, we had no business speaking to each other outside the courtroom. Practically, we ended up having a conversation in the parking lot of the county records office one October afternoon that lasted 3 hours and settled nothing about the case, but established something more durable than a ruling. What we discovered in that parking lot and in the years that followed was that we had arrived at our respective careers from different directions, but with the same underlying conviction that the most important thing in any room where truth was being determined was the integrity of the process, not the preferences of the person running it. George had walked away from a case, once a well-paying one in Buncombe County, because the client had asked him to shade a report. He told me about it without any particular pride, the way a person describes a decision that was simply obvious. I recognized that quality. I had made a version of the same decision more than once in less dramatic circumstances. We had been friends for 35 years by the time I stood in that woodshop and dialed his number. George retired from his investigative practice in 2010, not because the work had diminished, but because, as he put it, his knees had. He moved to a property in Yancey County, about an hour's drive north of the farm, where he kept bees maintained a sizable vegetable garden. And because George was constitutionally incapable of leaving things alone, continued to notice things. He had contacts throughout the western counties who called him occasionally with questions. He had databases he still accessed. He had, as I would discover, been paying attention to my situation for longer than I had been paying attention to it myself. During that first call in July, George told me things I was not prepared to hear. He had noticed the change in me, or rather the change in my visibility sometime in the late spring. A mutual acquaintance had mentioned in passing that Thomas Hargrove seemed to have gone quiet lately, that his son and daughter-in-law were very much present at any public occasion, but that Thomas himself seemed less like a man choosing to step back and more like a man who had been stepped back on behalf of. George, being George, had filed that observation and begun pulling threads. Over the 2 months between our last contact and my call from the wood shop, he had identified 3 transfers from the farm's operating account to an entity he could not find registered in North Carolina's business records. He had spoken quietly and directly with Frank Delgado, who confirmed that his calls had gone unreturned or been intercepted by someone who identified herself as Calvin's wife. He had obtained through channels he declined to specify over an unsecured line a partial picture of Calvin's financial situation that was significantly worse than I had imagined. $340,000 in outstanding debts. 2 creditors whose methods of collection were not, George suggested, carefully entirely conventional. A pattern of movement payments made, reversed routed through intermediary accounts that had the structure, though not yet the documentation of something that would interest a prosecutor. I sat in the woodshop with the old phone against my ear and listened to my friend tell me the shape of what had been happening around me, and what I felt was not surprise. It was the particular heavy sensation of having a suspicion confirmed that you had been hoping in some private part of yourself to be wrong about. "I need you to approach Dorothy," I told him when he had finished. "Separately from me. She won't take my call right now, and there are reasons for that. I'll explain another time. But she needs to know what you know, and she needs to hear it from someone she hasn't been told to distrust." George said he would handle it. He said it the way he said most things, without elaboration, without the need for reassurance on either end. We agreed on a protocol: no calls from the farmhouse landline, no contact through any device that Calvin or Serena could access. The old phone would stay in the woodshop. We would speak every 10 days unless something changed. Then I went back to the house and sat at the dinner table and watched Calvin and talk about a fence repair on the north boundary, and Serena describe a program she had seen on television. And I said very little and listened to everything. August passed quietly. I performed my role with the care that 30 years of maintaining a neutral courtroom expression had given me. I asked no questions that would signal awareness. I expressed no unusual interest in the mail, the accounts, or the schedule. I was, to all appearances, an aging man moving at an aging man's pace through the late summer of his 67th year. What I was doing, in fact, was watching. The morning of the 14th of September changed things. I woke at my usual hour a few minutes before 6 and went to the kitchen to start the coffee. Serena was already there, which was not unusual as she kept early hours, and she said, already brewed a pot. She handed me a mug with the particular attentive warmth she deployed in moments she wanted to appear domestic, and I took it to the kitchen table and sat down with the morning out the window. 3 sips in, something registered that I cannot describe precisely except to say that it was wrong. The flavor was altered in a way that had nothing to do with the beans or the roast. A faint undertone chemical rather than bitter, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't a man who had spent 2 months paying attention to everything. My thinking in the minutes that followed took on a slightly softened quality, not confusion exactly, but a reduction in sharpness that I recognized because I had not felt sharp for weeks and had only recently recovered my natural clarity. I stood up, took the mug to the back porch, and poured it into the pot of Eleanor's climbing roses that she had planted against the south-facing wall the summer of 2018. Then I came inside and rinsed the mug at the sink. For 3 days after that, I was more careful than I had ever been. On the 4th morning, Serena came into the kitchen, filled a fresh mug from the pot she had prepared, and carried it to me at the table with a smile that was warm and practiced and entirely confident. I smiled back. I thanked her. I wrapped both hands around the mug the way a man does when the morning is cool and the coffee is welcome. And I did not drink a single drop. If you're still here, comment "still here" so I know you're with me. And tell me this: if it were you, would you keep quiet and watch a little longer? Or make your move right now? I want to see your answer below. Also, a quick note before we continue. Parts of this story are enhanced for storytelling purposes. Not everything reflects real events, but the message is worth hearing. Serena mentioned the appointment on a Monday morning in early October. The way she mentioned most things she had already decided, as information rather than a proposal. She said my previous physician, Dr. Calloway, had retired at the end of September, which was true. She said she had taken the liberty of finding a replacement, a family practice doctor from the neighboring county, who made house calls for patients with limited mobility or transportation difficulties. She said it would save me a trip to town. She said it in a tone that implied the matter was settled, and that the appropriate response on my part was appreciation. I said that sounded fine. What I did not say was that I had already noticed Dr. Calloway's retirement notice in the local paper 3 weeks prior, that I had been intending to ask around for a recommendation myself, and that the speed with which Serena had produced an alternative, a doctor from outside Madison County, one with no existing relationship to me or to anyone in my social circle, struck me as the kind of detail worth noting. I added it to the notebook in the wood shop that evening, one line, no commentary. Dr. Leonard Marsh arrived on a Wednesday, and he was 58 years old, a lean man with close-cropped gray at his temples and eyeglasses with thin gold frames that gave him the appearance of someone who had been an academic before he became a clinician, which, as I later learned, was essentially accurate. He carried a worn leather bag that looked older than my desk, and moved through the front parlor with the unhurried manner of a man accustomed to entering houses in the middle of other people's difficult circumstances. Serena showed him in, offered coffee, and excused herself to the kitchen to prepare it. Dr. Marsh set his bag on the side table, opened the intake folder he had brought, and looked down at the patient name on the first page. Then he looked up at me. "Thomas Hargrove," he said. It was not a question. His voice had dropped just slightly into something more careful. "Circuit Judge, Madison County." "And retired," I said. He was quiet for a moment. From the kitchen came the sound of the cabinet opening, the familiar pull of the coffee drawer. "My father's name was Raymond Marsh," he said. "He owned a property in eastern Madison County, about 60 acres, a small cattle operation. In 2003, the insurance company handling his property coverage denied a structural damage claim, a denial that would have forced him to take out a loan he couldn't have repaid at his age. The case went to your court. I remembered it. Not immediately, not with the fluency that I could recall cases from my active years on the bench, but it came back as he spoke the specifics of the dispute, the pressure that had come from the insurance company's legal team regarding the disposition, the fact that the evidence had not supported their position regardless of the pressure. "You ruled in his favor," Dr. Marsh said, "and I was told later that there had been efforts to suggest a different outcome." "The evidence didn't support a different outcome," I said. He nodded once slowly. "My father kept the property until he passed in 2005. His last instruction to me was to find a way to thank Judge Hargrove." He paused. I never found the occasion until now. The kitchen sounds had stopped. Dr. Marsh reached into the folder and withdrew a prescription pad. He wrote methodically, tore the sheet free, and held it out to me. Beneath the printed prescription, a standard blood pressure medication, nothing unusual. There was a second slip of paper, smaller, folded once. On it was an email address handwritten. "For any questions about your care," he said evenly, as Serena came back through the doorway with 2 cups on a tray. I sent the first message from the wood shop the following evening, using the old laptop I kept there for lumber calculations, and had connected to a cellular signal booster rather than the house network. Dr. Marsh responded within the hour. Over the next 2 weeks, he made 2 additional visits to the farm, both scheduled through Serena, both conducted with the professional composure of a man doing exactly what he appeared to be doing. On the second visit, while Serena was occupied with a phone call in the back of the house, he removed a small vial from his bag and showed it to me briefly before returning it. He had obtained it, he explained in a subsequent message, from the kitchen medication drawer during a moment when the house was briefly unoccupied, a moment that George had helped arrange through a pretext I was not fully informed of. The compound in that vial, according to a laboratory contact doctor, Marsh trusted was a substance known to produce temporary cognitive dulling and disorientation when administered in small, repeated doses. The effects were consistent with early-stage memory impairment. They were also, he wrote, entirely reversible once exposure ceased. More importantly, he had completed and signed a formal medical assessment, concluding that I was in full possession of my cognitive faculties, that there was no clinical basis for any claim of diminished capacity. I read that assessment 3 times in the woodshop, by the light of the old work lamp, and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a long time. George received the documents the following week. He called on the woodshop phone 4 days later with the news that he had been tracking a parallel development, a set of legal filings in preparation routed through an attorney in Asheville. That outlined a petition for legal guardianship over my person and estate. The basis cited was cognitive decline. The evidence offered would have included the fabricated medical history Serena had been constructing, along with statements from Calvin regarding my supposed confusion and inability to manage my affairs. George had already been in contact with Patricia Hale, the assistant district attorney for Madison County, a woman he had worked with on a financial fraud case several years prior, and whose judgment he trusted. Patricia had reviewed what George had gathered and offered a clear assessment. The evidence was not yet sufficient for charges that would hold. More critically, any premature action on our part would alert Calvin and Serena in time for them to dispose of documents, close accounts, and construct a version of events that would be significantly harder to prosecute. The strength of a case like this, Patricia had told George, lay in allowing the other side to believe they were succeeding until the moment they were not. We would wait. We would continue gathering, and we would be ready. They're filing for guardianship, Tom, George said over the phone that night, his voice steady and deliberate. The hearing is scheduled in 3 weeks. If it goes through the farm, the accounts everything, it's gone. The line was quiet for a moment. Then we make sure it doesn't go through, I said. Dorothy did not go quietly. I did not know this at the time. I was still managing appearances at the farm, still carrying my empty coffee mug back to the kitchen each morning with the practiced calm of a man who had nothing to hide. It was George who told me what Dorothy had done weeks later, after enough of the pieces were in place, that he felt he could share it without compromising what we were building. What she had done was this. She had gone home to Boone, and she had sat with her anger for 3 days. And then she had set the anger aside, and done what a former school teacher does when something doesn't add up. She had gone back to the primary sources. She pulled up every conversation she could remember from her visit to the farm in July. Not just the content, but the sequence, the timing, the specific moments when Serena had been present and when she had not. She thought carefully about what she had actually said in the kitchen that evening, what she had said to whom, and what would have needed to be changed for the version Serena had brought to me to be true. She found that nothing fit, that the story Serena had told me required Dorothy to have said things she had not said, in a tone she did not use to a person she had never been alone with long enough to say them. Dorothy is not a woman who doubts herself easily, but she is also not a woman who moves without being certain. She spent 2 weeks going over it from every angle before she picked up the phone and called George Pittman. She had his number because George had been a fixture in the county long enough that most people with long memories had it somewhere. George met her at a diner in Weaverville on a Thursday in early November, a place far enough from Madison County that the meeting would not produce any useful gossip. He told me later that she arrived 7 minutes early and already had her notes out on the table when he walked in a spiral notebook, 3 pages of her own handwriting. Dates and impressions and questions organized in the orderly fashion of a woman who had spent decades getting children to think clearly about evidence. They talked for 2 hours. George confirmed what she had suspected about the broader situation without telling her more than she needed in order to make a decision. The decision she made was the right one. She went home and retrieved a box she had been keeping in the hall closet since the spring of 2022. Eleanor had given it to her during the last difficult months, not dramatically, not with any formal ceremony, but in the quiet way that 2 women who have known each other for 40 years communicate about things that matter. She had handed Dorothy a small lockbox and said simply that she had been writing some things down and that Dorothy should keep it somewhere safe. She said to open it only if it became necessary. She did not explain what necessary meant. She did not need to. Dorothy had respected that instruction for a year and a half without opening the box. She opened it the night after she met with George. Inside were 43 pages in Eleanor's handwriting, not a formal diary exactly, more like the private notes of a woman who was running out of time and wanted to make sure that what she had observed did not disappear with her. The entries spanned 14 months from February of 2021 through the end of March of 2022. The early entries were about small things, the progress of the roses she could no longer tend herself, the quality of the light in October, things she wanted Thomas to know about the house. As the months went on, the entries changed. Calvin and Serena had visited frequently during that period, at first every few weeks, and then more regularly as Eleanor's condition made it increasingly clear that time was running short. Eleanor wrote about those visits with the careful, measured attention of a woman who had spent 40 years watching her husband read people for a living and had learned something from the observation. George read me the relevant passage over the phone, his voice even, and deliberate the way it always was when he wanted to be sure something landed precisely. There is something wrong with this woman. She looks at Thomas's land the way a hawk looks at something small in a field below it. She is patient in a way that frightens me. She asks questions that sound like care but feel like inventory. Calvin looks at her the way a man looks at someone he is afraid to disappoint. I do not think he is a bad person. I think he is a weak one, and I think she knows exactly how to use that. I am afraid of what she will do when I am no longer here to see it. The entry was dated September 14th, 2021. I sat in the woodshop with the phone against my ear and did not speak for a long time. Eleanor knew, I said finally. She knew, George said. It was George who suggested the watch. Not immediately, this was 2 weeks after the conversation about the journal, after we had both had time to think through what was still ahead. Calvin's behavior had been escalating in small ways since the guardianship filing, a harder edge at dinner, a shorter tolerance for any question I asked about the accounts, a particular look he had developed when I entered a room where he and Serena were already talking. George said he wanted to install a location transmitter in the watch the old Belova Eleanor had given me, the one I wore every day. He said it was a precaution. He said it in the particular careful way he used, when he wanted to make something sound minor that was not entirely minor. Just in case, Tom, he said, just in case. I thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long. I left the watch on the fence post at the north boundary of the property on a Tuesday morning, and George collected it and returned it by Thursday evening. And after that it sat on my wrist the same as it always had, except that it was no longer only a watch. The guardianship hearing was held in the second week of December, in a courtroom in Asheville that I had appeared in twice during my years on the bench. I sat at the respondent's table with an attorney George had retained, and I watched Dr. Leonard Marsh take the stand and describe in precise clinical language the results of his examination and the content of the laboratory analysis he had commissioned. Calvin and Serena's attorney objected to the laboratory report on procedural grounds. The objection was overruled. The medical assessment was entered into the record. The petition was denied in full. The judge's language was measured but unambiguous. There was no clinical basis for the determination of diminished capacity. The petition was without merit. Court costs were assigned to the petitioners. I did not look at Calvin during the ruling. I looked at the middle distance the way I had trained myself to look during difficult verdicts on the other side of the bench, present composed, giving nothing away. In the hallway outside, as the attorneys gathered their documents and the attendants cleared the gallery, Calvin came to stand beside me. He leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "This isn't over, old man," he said. I looked at my son. I looked at his face, Eleanor's jaw, my forehead, the combination I had once thought miraculous, and I understood in that moment that what I felt was not the anger I had carried as a judge toward men who believed themselves above consequence. It was not the grief I had been carrying since the spring of 2022, What I felt standing in that hallway was something I had very rarely felt for anyone who had sat across from me in a courtroom. Pity. He knocked on my bedroom door on a Thursday evening 3 days after the hearing. I was at the small writing desk by the window, reading through an old case digest I had pulled from the shelf, not for any particular reason, just for the comfort of familiar material. The knock was unhurried, the knock of a man who was not worried about the answer. Calvin stood in the doorway in a collared shirt and a jacket I had not seen before. He was smiling, the full smile, the one that reached his eyes, the one I had not seen directed at me in months. He said he wanted to take me to dinner. He said he knew things had been tense lately, and that he was sorry for that, and that he thought a good meal and some time together might do them both good. He named the restaurant Harlan's Steakhouse on the east side of town. The place with the dark wood paneling and the good bourbon selection and the tables far enough apart that you could have a real conversation. I looked at my son in the doorway and I said, "That sounded fine." What I did not tell Calvin was that I knew Harlan's well, not as a place I had discovered in recent years, but as a place Eleanor and I had gone for 31 years of anniversaries and quiet celebrations. A place where the host knew our names, and the corner booth in the back had been ours by informal understanding since before Calvin was old enough to eat steak. I had not been back since Eleanor passed. I had not been ready. I understood that Calvin either knew this and had chosen the location deliberately or did not know it and had chosen it for other reasons. I was not certain which possibility I found more troubling. I took my suit jacket from the closet, a charcoal wool the one I wore when the occasion required something presentable, but not formal. In the inside breast pocket, I placed a small digital recorder that George had passed to me 2 weeks prior through the dead drop arrangement we had established at the north fence post. The recorder was no larger than a pocket knife. George had shown me the single-button operation press once to begin, press again to pause. I pressed it once in the bathroom mirror, confirmed the small indicator light came on, and put the jacket on. Then I checked the watch. Eleanor's watch pressed my thumb, once against the worn edge of the case, the way I had done in the forest on the night this story began, and went downstairs. Serena was in the kitchen when I came down. She looked up from what she was doing and said, with the warm register she used for performances, that it was good to see us going out together, that it had been too long, that she hoped we'd have a wonderful evening. I told her thank you and followed Calvin out to the truck. Harlan's was quieter on a Thursday than on weekends, which I suspected was part of the calculation. The host showed us to a booth near the back, not our booth, the one 2 tables over, and left us with menus we both knew well enough not to need. Calvin ordered a bourbon. I ordered water and kept my hand near the outside of my jacket pocket, where I could feel the slight weight of the recorder. What followed was the most carefully constructed meal I have ever sat through. Calvin was warm, in the way a very good actor is warm, not overdone, not with the quality of performance that trips itself up through excess, but with the practiced ease of someone who has found the correct register and is holding it. He asked about the farm, about the south pasture, about whether the equipment barn roof had been looked at yet. He poured from the breadbasket the way you pour for someone you are comfortable with. He laughed at the right moments, paused at the right moments, left space in the conversation, the way a person does when they want you to feel heard. Somewhere in the middle of the main course, he mentioned Eleanor. He said it quietly, looking down at his plate for a moment before looking up. He said he had been thinking about her lately. He said he missed her in the way that you miss someone who was the center of a thing, and that the farm felt different without her, in ways he found difficult to describe. His voice dropped just slightly on her name. His expression arranged itself into something that looked from across the table very much like genuine grief. I held my bourbon glass with both hands and watched my son's face and said nothing. I had spent 30 years watching people perform emotions they did not feel. I had also spent 30 years watching people feel emotions they did not know how to express. The difference was not always obvious from the outside. And on that particular night, sitting in a booth, 2 tables from where Eleanor and I had spent 31 years of quiet celebrations, I allowed myself the possibility that both things might be true at once, that Calvin could be performing grief and feeling it simultaneously, that a man could be capable of what he was capable of and still carry something real beneath it. I filed that thought away for later. There would be time for it later. What I needed in that moment was to stay exactly where I was present, composed, giving nothing away. He suggested a drive when the bill was settled. "Let the meal settle," he said, pulling on his jacket. "Take the long way back. I haven't driven out north of town in a while." I said that was fine. We walked out into the December cold together, our breath visible in the parking lot. Light, and I thought briefly of all the times I had walked out of that restaurant with Eleanor's hand in the crook of my arm. I let the thought pass. There was no useful place for it tonight. Calvin drove without urgency. The truck moved through the east side of town, past the hardware store and the county records building, and the old post office through the intersection, where Route 26 met the county road north, and then out past the last of the streetlights into the dark beyond the town limits. The road narrowed. The trees came up on both sides, the long-leaf pines, old growth, the kind that have been there longer than any dispute over any piece of land in this county. I watched the road. I did not speak. Calvin did not speak. The clock on the dashboard read 11:17. I kept my right hand relaxed in my lap, and my left hand resting on the door panel near the window, and I breathed slowly the way I had learned to breathe during difficult sessions through the nose measured out without any sound. The recorder in my breast pocket was running. The watch on my left wrist was doing what it had been designed recently to do. The truck slowed, turned off the main road onto a gravel track. I recognized the old forestry service road, the one the county had stopped maintaining in the 90s. The branches scraped the mirror. The headlights cut through the dark between the trees and found nothing on the other side. Calvin brought the truck to a stop. He put it in park. His hands came off the wheel and settled in his lap. The engine went quiet, and then there was only the wind moving through the tops of the pine trees and the absolute dark pressing in from every direction and the sound of my own breathing and the faint weight of the recorder against my chest. The glove compartment opened without a word. Calvin reached across and placed two things on my knee, a manila envelope and a pen. He had prepared this in advance, brought it to dinner in his jacket, or left it waiting in the truck. Now it sat on my knee in the dark of a forestry road, 45 miles from the farm, and my son was looking straight ahead at nothing, both hands back on the wheel. I drew out the top sheet far enough to read the heading by the pale dashboard light. Deed of transfer, Hargrove Farm and Associated Assets, Madison County, North Carolina. I read the first two lines. Then I put the papers back in the envelope, set it on the dashboard, and placed the pen on top of it. "Oh no," I said. Calvin turned to look at me. What moved across his face was not rage. It was colder than rage and more considered. It arrived and settled the way a decision settles, rather than the way an emotion does. "The forest has a way of making old men think clearly, Dad," he said. His voice was quiet, measured. "You should take your time." I looked at my son the way I had looked at men in courtrooms, when I needed to see them plainly past what I wanted them to be, down to what they were. I saw the flatness behind his eyes, the calm of a person who believes they hold every advantage. Then I opened my door. The December cold came in, immediately sharp, dry, unambiguous. My boots found gravel. I stood up slowly with the full deliberateness the moment deserved and closed the door behind me. Calvin did not call after me. The engine idled for a long moment. Then the truck reverse turned, and the taillights curved with the forestry road and disappeared. The quiet that followed was total. I was not afraid. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. What I felt standing in that forest was not fear, but something quieter and more complicated, the sensation of a long, compressed weight finally finding the shape of the container it had been poured into. A situation that had been building since April had arrived at last, at the form it was always moving toward. I found a pine tree with a wide root system and sat down on the largest root, brushing aside the needles first. Old habit. I rested my left wrist on my knee and looked at the watch in the faint light. The bulova Eleanor had pressed into my hands on our 30th anniversary, a Saturday in May of 2012, when the farm was full of late spring light, and she said she wanted me to carry something of hers. The crystal was scratched. The band had been replaced twice. The watch itself never had been and never would be. George had modified it 6 weeks ago at the north fence line. I pressed my thumb against the worn edge of the case and looked up through the gap in the pines at the cold, dark sky. I waited. 32 minutes. I had counted them as a discipline the way you track time, when time is the only variable you're managing. The cold was real, but manageable. My coat was adequate. I had dressed that morning with the theory that Calvin's invitation arriving 3 days after a courtroom defeat was unlikely to be entirely benign. A man who spent 30 years evaluating evidence learns not to dismiss his own assessments. At 32 minutes, headlights appeared at the far end of the road. Steady, unhurried, not sweeping the trees like a searching vehicle, but moving with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where to go. A Ford F-150 navy blue came to a stop 20 feet from where I sat. George Pittman stepped out in his brown canvas work coat, carrying a stainless steel thermos. He looked at me on the pine root, took in the scene with the composure of a man who had anticipated it and said nothing for a moment. Then did it land. Every word I said. He crossed to me and held out the thermos. I unscrewed the cap, and the smell of coffee rose into the cold air between us. Can you walk to the truck? Not concerned, practical directness. I have been sitting on a tree root for half an hour, I said. I can walk to the truck. He drove without speaking for the first several miles, which was the right instinct. We went to his property in Yancey County, an hour north. I slept in the guest room. By 5:30, George had coffee on the stove, and we sat at his kitchen table in the early dark and worked through what the recording had captured and what needed to happen next. By 6 o'clock, the plan was clear enough to act on. He drove me back to the farm before Calvin would be awake. The truck moved through the early morning dark through Yancey County and into Madison, past fence lines and fields I had known for 40 years. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched them pass and said nothing. George said nothing. Some decisions don't need to be explained. They only need to be made. George dropped me at the equipment yard gate at 6 o'clock exactly. I went in through the wood shop the way we had planned, through the side door with the spare key I kept on a hook behind the lathe, through the yard and in through the back of the house before the kitchen light came on in any window. The farmhouse was still dark and quiet. December mornings in Madison County have a particular quality the cold holds overnight and releases slowly, and the fields carry a pale frost that catches the first gray light before the sun has any real strength. I hung up my coat. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink. Then I filled the old percolator from the bag of ground coffee I kept in the back of the cabinet, not the coffee Serena bought. The dark roast in the red bag that I had been drinking since before Calvin was born, and I set it on the stove and waited for it to run. I sat down at the kitchen table with my mug when it was ready, my back to the window facing the doorway to the hall, and I read the 2-day-old newspaper that was still folded on the corner of the table where I had left it. Outside, the fields were coming up gray and silver in the early light. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and sat there for a while, apparently satisfied with the view. At 7:15, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Calvin came into the kitchen, the way he always did in the morning, shirt untucked, moving without full attention, reaching for the cabinet above the coffee maker before he had entirely processed the room. He had the cabinet open and his hand on a mug before he registered that someone was sitting at the table. He stopped. The color left his face in the specific way that color leaves a face when the body understands something before the mind has finished calculating it. He stood with his hand still on the cabinet door and looked at me sitting at the kitchen table with my newspaper and my coffee. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything. I looked up from the paper. "Good morning, Calvin," I said. "Coffee's on the stove. Help yourself." He did not move for another moment. Then he set the mug down on the counter without filling it and walked back out of the kitchen without a word. I turned the page of the newspaper. I heard them from behind the closed door of my study 20 minutes later. Not the words, just the register. Serena's voice low and fast, Calvin's shorter, tighter responses. The particular cadence of two people who have encountered a variable they did not account for and are trying very quickly to recalculate. I had heard that cadence in hallways outside courtrooms more times than I could count. I finished my coffee. I rinsed the mug. I put on my good coat and my boots, and I drove into town. Patricia Hale's office was on the second floor of the Madison County Courthouse, a corner room with windows that faced the parking lot on one side and the old courthouse lawn on the other. She was 45 years old, with the focused economical manner of someone who had been doing serious work for long enough that she no longer needed to perform seriousness. George was already there when I arrived, seated across from her desk, with a file folder open in front of him. Patricia stood when I came in, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair beside George's. "Nay, Judge Hargrove," she said. The title was a courtesy I had been retired for 3 years, but she used it with a matter-of-factness that told me she was not reaching for flattery. She simply considered it accurate. We spent the next 2 hours going through the material George had assembled. Patricia moved through it with the systematic attention of someone building a structure, rather than reviewing a document, asking specific questions about the chain of custody for the audio. Recording the laboratory analysis, Dr. Marsh had commissioned the financial records George had compiled. She paused over Eleanor's journal and read the relevant entries twice without comment. When she had finished, she sat back and looked at both of us. "This is sufficient," she said. "It is more than sufficient." She paused. "I want to be clear about what happens now. The moment I file the financial accounts associated with Calvin and Serena, Hargrove will be flagged for immediate freeze through the banking authority. Their travel documents will be entered into the federal alert system. Neither of them will be able to move funds or leave the country between the filing and the arrest." "How long between filing and arrest?" George asked. "It's same business day," Patricia said. "I'm not giving this room to breathe." I signed the formal complaint at 10:47 in the morning. I signed it at Patricia's desk, with the same deliberate, unhurried motion I had used for every significant document in my professional life, not because the moment required performance, but because some actions deserve to be done with full intention. Patricia filed at 11:15. I drove out to the edge of the county after that. Not for any particular reason, I simply needed to be somewhere that was not an office and not the farm for an hour. I drove the roads I had driven for 40 years, through the towns and past the fields, and along the creek bottom, where the sycamores had gone bare for winter, and I let the morning move at its own pace outside the window. At 2 o'clock, I stopped at a diner in Marshall and had a bowl of soup and a piece of cornbread. And I sat at the counter and watched the lunch crowd thin out and did not think about anything in particular. At 4:47 in the afternoon, Patricia Hale signed the arrest warrant. George sent me a single word on the woodshop phone at 4:51, "Done." I sat with that for a moment. Then I started the truck and pulled back onto the highway toward home. By the time I turned into the long drive of the farm for dinner, the machinery had begun to move. And machinery like that, once it has been properly set in motion, does not stop. Before we go on, just a quick note, parts of this story are shaped with fictional elements for a more engaging experience. If this resonates with you, feel free to share and subscribe to follow upcoming stories. And if this isn't your kind of content, you're always free to step away at any time. 1 week passed. I will not pretend it was an easy week. I went through the motions of the farm, the morning walk, the equipment check, the feeding schedule, and I sat across from Calvin and Serena at dinner each evening with the same composed neutrality I had maintained for months. They were quieter now, more careful. The particular energy in the house had shifted from controlled pressure to something more brittle. The way ice shifts when the temperature has been rising for days and the surface is still intact, but the structure beneath has begun to give. I did not know exactly when the officers would come. Patricia had told me the timing would be within the week, coordinated with the financial freeze to prevent any last-minute movement of assets. She had told me to be present at the property and to stay out of the way when it happened. On the 8th morning, I came down to the kitchen at my usual hour, made breakfast, and ate alone at the table with the winter fields going pale in the early light outside the window. At 7:20, I heard tires on the gravel drive. Not one vehicle, two. I stood up from the table and walked to the hall doorway. From there, I could see the length of the entrance hall to the front door, and beyond it, through the sidelight windows, the shape of 2 vehicles pulling up to the front of the house. I went to the foot of the stairs and stopped there. One hand on the newel post, weight settled the way a man stands when he has decided to observe and not to intervene. The knock came hard and official, the knock that carries its own authority, regardless of who opens the door. Calvin came down the stairs first. He was in the clothes he slept in, his hair not yet arranged, and he moved with the residual confidence of a man who has not yet registered what kind of morning this is. He reached the front door and opened it. What happened to his face in the next 3 seconds was something I had witnessed from the other side of a courtroom, many times the specific, irreversible moment when a person understands that the calculation they have been running has reached its end. He took a step backward. His mouth opened and closed once. The lead officer was a woman in her 40s with a Madison County Sheriff's Department jacket and a manner that was professional and entirely without drama. She identified herself, stated that she had a warrant for the arrest of Calvin Hargrove and Serena Hargrove, and began reading the charges in the level. Procedural voice of someone who has done this a great many times. Elder financial abuse. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Deliberate administration of a cognitive-altering substance to a vulnerable adult. Unlawful attempt to seize property through coercion. 4 counts. I heard Serena before I saw her, a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the living room. She had come to the doorway between the living room and the hall, and she was standing with both hands gripped around the back of the sofa, the way a person grips something solid when they need an anchor. Her face had the particular stillness of someone who is processing consequences they had, until this moment, considered theoretical. The officers were efficient and unhurried. Within minutes, both Calvin and Serena had been moved to the entrance hall. The restraints went on, with a metallic sound that carried through the quiet of the farmhouse the way sounds carry in the early morning when there is nothing else competing with them. Calvin turned his head and looked up at me. I was standing at the foot of the stairs, one hand still on the newel post, and I looked back at him. I did not move toward him. I did not speak. I held his gaze the way I had held the gaze of every person who had ever sat across from me in a proceeding that required my full and undivided attention, present steady, entirely without the need for the moment to be anything other than what it was. He looked at me for a long time. Then the officers moved, and he moved with them, and the front door opened onto the December morning. I watched through the sidelight window as the 2 vehicles crossed the gravel drive and turned out onto the county road. The last of the brake lights disappeared around the curve at the bottom of the hill. The farm went quiet. I stood in the entrance hall alone for a while, my hand still on the newel post. Then I went back to the kitchen and finished my breakfast. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Patricia Hale in her corner office at the courthouse. She had updates, and she had a warning, and she gave me both with the same measured directness she applied to everything. The financial freeze had captured substantially all of the assets Calvin and Serena had moved, not every dollar, but enough that restitution was viable. The prosecution's evidentiary position was strong. She expected to proceed to trial in February. The warning was Wade Coleman. He was 50 years old, a criminal defense attorney out of Asheville who had built a reputation over 2 decades for a specific courtroom strategy when the evidence against his client was strong. He redirected the jury's attention toward the credibility of the person making the accusation. He did not argue that his clients were innocent, so much as he argued that the other side was not trustworthy. He had done it successfully more than once with elderly complainants whose histories could be made to look in the right light like liabilities. Patricia told me this without softening it, which I respected. "He'll go after your record," she said. "Specific cases. He'll look for anything that can be framed as bias, error, or impropriety. His goal will be to make the jury wonder about you before they wonder about Calvin." I nodded. "He'll have done his research," she continued, "and he is very good at what he does." "I know what he does," I said. "I've been watching attorneys like Wade Coleman walk into courtrooms since before he passed the bar exam." Patricia looked at me for a moment. "Good," she said. "Then you know what to expect." I drove home through the early winter dark, the familiar roads running past familiar fields, and I thought about what Patricia had said. Wade Coleman was skilled. He was experienced. He had a strategy that had worked before, but I had spent a career in rooms where people like him operated. I had watched them construct narratives, redirect attention, locate the weaknesses in a case and press. I understood the mechanics of what he would attempt. Now I would be sitting in the chair on the other side of the courtroom. I was not afraid. I had spent an entire professional life watching men like him work, and I understood every move they made before they made it. I had not worn the black suit since the day I retired. It had been cleaned and pressed and returned to the closet 3 years ago, and there it had stayed, not as a relic exactly, but as something I was not ready to make a decision about. It was the suit I had worn on the first morning I sat behind the bench in courtroom 4 in February of 1990, 34 years ago, when I was 33 years old, and the weight of the robe felt like something that needed to be earned rather than simply put on. I had worn it on the last morning too in the spring of 2020, when I had sat for the final time in that same room and felt with the clarity that finality brings, that I had tried to do the work as honestly as I knew how. I put it on in the hotel room at 6:15 in the morning. It still fit. The fabric held its shape the way good wool does. I stood at the mirror for a moment, adjusted the collar, and looked at the man looking back at me. Then I went down to the lobby and ate breakfast alone, and at 8:30, I walked into the Madison County Courthouse for the first time as a complainant. Courtroom 4 was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps it simply felt that way from the other side. I had presided in this room for the better part of 2 decades. I knew the grain of the wood on the bench, the way the afternoon light came through the west windows in March, the specific acoustic quality that made voices carry differently depending on where in the room a person was standing. I had read that room the way a musician reads an instrument intuitively, automatically after enough time together. Sitting at the complainant's table with my back to the gallery and the judge's bench elevated in front of me, the room felt like a place I knew well that had been rearranged in the night. All the same furniture, none of the same orientation. Calvin was already seated at the defense table when I came in. He wore a gray suit and a tie that was straight and properly knotted in a way that spoke of Serena's preparation rather than his own. Wade Coleman sat beside him, a compact man in his 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who conserves his energy for when it is needed. He did not look at me when I entered. He was reading something pen in hand, making small notations in the margin. Serena sat at a separate table to the left, with her own attorney, a woman I did not recognize, and this detail registered as significant in the way that procedural details register when you have spent a career understanding what they mean. Defendants in joint proceedings do not retain separate counsel unless their interests have been assessed as potentially divergent. Someone somewhere in the past weeks had made a calculation. I noted it and said nothing. The first 2 days proceeded with the methodical deliberateness of a well-prepared prosecution. Patricia presented the chronology with the clean, unhurried confidence of someone who has organized her material so thoroughly that she does not need to rush. She walked the jury through the timeline from Calvin and Serena's arrival at the farm in April of 2023, through the financial transfers, the isolation of Dorothy, the medical evidence, the audio recording from the forestry road. She was precise with numbers, precise with dates, and she paused at the moments that deserved pausing. The jury was 12 people, a retired postal worker, 2 teachers, a contractor, a woman who ran the diner in Marshall that I had eaten at the afternoon the warrant was signed, and 7 others whose faces I was learning the way I had always learned the faces of people whose attention mattered. Their expressions during Patricia's presentation were neutral in the way that careful jurors are neutral, processing, not reacting. Coleman's cross-examinations on the first 2 days were measured. He planted small seeds of doubt in the testimony of George's financial contacts, pressed on the chain of custody for the laboratory analysis, asked questions designed not to win points, but to accumulate a general atmosphere of uncertainty. He was good at it. I had said as much to Patricia, and watching him work confirmed the assessment. Calvin did not look at me during those first 2 days. I did not look at him either. The third day was different. Coleman came in with a document file that was thicker than anything he had used in the first 2 sessions, and he moved through the morning with a focused energy that told me, before he said a word, that we had arrived at the move Patricia had warned me about. He waited until mid-afternoon during a lull between witness examinations to introduce the material. He framed it as relevant to the pattern of the complainant's professional conduct, specifically to the question of whether Thomas Hargrove's testimony and credibility should be considered in isolation from his history on the bench. The case he cited was from 2003, a land and property dispute in eastern Madison County. Coleman described it in the steady, authoritative tone of a man presenting a fact that has already been established, that Thomas Hargrove had ruled in favor of a particular family in that case, and that within 2 years of that ruling, A member of the extended family of the prevailing party had provided renovation and repair services to the Hargrove farm property at a rate significantly below market value, creating. Coleman argued the appearance of a benefit flowing from a favorable judicial outcome. He did not use the word bribery. He did not need to. The structure of the argument carried the implication without requiring him to state it. I sat straight in my chair. I kept my face the way I had always kept my face when something unexpected was presented in my courtroom, attentive, composed, entirely without the reaction that would have given the other side anything useful. Beneath the table, my right hand had closed into a fist against my thigh. Two jurors in the second row shifted their attention from Coleman to me. A third tilted her head slightly, the specific micro-movement of someone revising a preliminary assessment. Patricia was on her feet within seconds, objecting on the grounds that the characterization was unsupported and the implication unsubstantiated. The judge, a woman in her late 50s who had been managing the proceeding with careful impartiality, sustained the objection, but allowed the underlying case reference to remain as a matter of record subject to proper evidentiary support. Patricia requested an adjournment to the following morning. It was granted. George and Dorothy worked until 3 in the morning. I knew this because George sent brief updates to the woodshop phone, which I had brought to the hotel at 11:01 and again at 2:47. Each message was short and factual. By the last one, they had located what we needed. I sat in the hotel room with the lights low, the suit jacket draped over the chair, and Eleanor's watch held in both hands against my chest. Not on my wrist and my hands the way you hold something you need to feel the weight of. One more day, I said to the room. Not a prayer exactly, not out loud to anyone in particular, just the words a person says when they need to hear them in their own voice. I just need one more day. I saw him as soon as I came through the courtroom doors. Dr. Leonard Marsh was seated in the front row of the witness gallery on the far left side, not the general seating, but the designated area where scheduled witnesses waited before being called. He had a folder on his lap, thick the kind that holds more than a single document. He was sitting with the particular stillness of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to say and is simply waiting for the moment to say it. He did not look up when I entered. I did not acknowledge him. I walked to the complainant's table, set down my folder, and took my seat. Patricia was already arranging her materials. She glanced at me once, a brief assessor's look, and gave a small nod. I returned it. Across the room, Wade Coleman was speaking quietly with Calvin, his head inclined, pen moving in his hand. Whatever advantage he believed he had carried into this morning, his posture said he intended to press it. The judge called the session to order at 9 o'clock. Patricia stood. The prosecution calls Dr. Leonard Marsh. He walked to the stand with the same unhurried competence he had brought to my parlor 4 months earlier. The worn leather bag replaced today by the folder. The house call manner replaced by something equally composed but more formal. He was sworn in, stated his name and credentials, and sat with the folder closed on his knee. Patricia began with the medical evidence. She walked him through the laboratory findings, the clinical assessment, the formal determination that I was in full possession of my faculties at the time of the guardianship petition. Coleman had challenged this material on the second day. Patricia was rebuilding it now, with the doctor present and subject to direct examination. Doctor, Marsh answered each question with precise clinical language and without embellishment. He was, as I had understood him to be, from the beginning a man who did not need to perform confidence because he simply had it. Then Patricia shifted. Dr. Marsh, she said, you indicated that you were familiar with the complainant prior to this case. Can you describe the nature of that familiarity? Coleman was on his feet. Objection, relevance, goes directly to the credibility of the witness's prior testimony regarding the 2003 land case, Patricia said. The defense introduced that case. We are entitled to address it fully. The judge looked at Coleman for a moment. Overruled. The witness may answer. Dr. Marsh opened the folder. He described his father, Raymond Marsh, a man who had run a small cattle operation in eastern Madison County on 60 acres that had been in the family for 3 generations. He described the insurance dispute that had threatened that property in 2003, a structural damage claim denied by the coverage provider on grounds that, when examined in court, did not hold. He described the pressure that had come from the insurance company's legal representative's pressure that, in his understanding, had been applied not only in the courtroom, but through channels that operated alongside it. He described the ruling. Judge Hargrove found in my father's favor, he said. The property was preserved. My father kept it until he passed in 2005. Patricia held up a document in a clear protective sleeve. Dr. Marsh, I am showing you what has been marked Prosecution Exhibit 17. Can you identify this? He looked at it. That is a letter my father wrote in the spring of 2004. I have had it in my possession since his passing. The letter was entered into evidence, and the relevant portion read aloud by Patricia in the measured tone she used for material that needed to land without theatrical emphasis. I attempted to express my gratitude to Judge Hargrove on 2 occasions. On both occasions, he declined. He said the ruling reflected the evidence and nothing more, and that if I wished to express gratitude for the functioning of the legal system, I should direct a contribution to the Madison County Legal Aid Office, which I did. I want it recorded somewhere that there are still men in positions of authority who use that authority exactly as it was intended. The letter was dated March of 2004. Patricia set it down. No further questions. Coleman stood for cross-examination. He approached the stand with the measured confidence he had maintained throughout, and he returned to the renovation contract, the repair work performed on the Hargrove property that he had framed. The day before, as a potential benefit flowing from a favorable ruling, he asked Dr. Marsh whether he was aware of the contract. Dr. Marsh said he was not personally aware of it. Coleman pressed, was the contractor not associated with families connected to the 2003 case? The contractor, Patricia said from her table without rising, was Mr. Harold Briggs, the complainant's brother-in-law by his late wife's family. He performed the work in 2007, 4 years after the ruling. The Briggs and Marsh families have no documented connection. This was established in the materials provided to the court yesterday evening. The judge looked at Coleman. Coleman looked at his notes. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, not long in the ordinary flow of a courtroom session, but the kind of pause that a room notices. Coleman asked 2 more questions that did not recover the ground he had lost, and then said he had no further examination. Dr. Marsh gathered his folder. Before he stepped down from the stand, he turned and looked directly at me. Not at the gallery, not at the judge. At me. My father asked me to thank you, Judge Hargrove, he said. His voice was level, but carried the particular weight of something that has been held for a long time. I'm sorry it took 21 years. I looked down at my hands on the table. I had spent a career keeping my face still in moments that required it. I kept it still now. But I looked at my hands, Eleanor's watch on my left wrist, the scratched crystal catching the courtroom light, and I allowed myself one moment that belonged entirely to me and no one else in that room. Then I looked up. The jury had shifted, not dramatically, not the visible collective movement of a group responding to theater, but the quality of attention in the box had changed in the way attention changes when a room has received information that reorganizes what came before it. Several jurors were looking at the defense table. Calvin was looking at the floor, not at Coleman, not at the judge, not at me. At the floor directly in front of his chair, with the particular stillness of a man who has gone somewhere internal and does not yet know how to come back from it. I observed this. I recorded it in the way I had always recorded things, without interpretation, without projection, simply as a fact about what was present in the room at that moment. What it meant I did not say. Some things mean themselves. Dorothy walked to the witness stand without looking at me. I understood that. We had not spoken since the phone call 5 months earlier, the one I had placed in anger with Serena's voice still in my ear, and the damage from which had not been repaired, because the circumstances had not permitted repair. Dorothy had done what she did, the investigation, the journal, the cooperation with George, without any reconciliation between us. She had done it because it was right, and because she was the kind of person who does right things regardless of the personal cost. She was 63 years old. Her hair was silver, and pinned back cleanly the way she had worn it for as long as I could remember. Her hands, when she settled them on the rail of the witness box, were absolutely still. Patricia stood. "Ms. Hargrove, can you describe your relationship to the complainant?" "He's my brother," Dorothy said. Her voice was clear and unhesitating. "Older by 2 years. We grew up on the same property he's trying to keep." She began with the visit in July, the afternoon at the farm, the apple pie, the walk to the equipment barn. She described what she had actually said in the kitchen that evening with Serena. Nothing about attorneys, nothing about capacity, nothing about legal trustees. She had talked about the roof on the equipment barn. That was the full extent of it. She described the phone call that followed and the drive back to the farm 3 days later, and standing at the front door, knocking until her knuckles were sore, while her brother stood on the other side of it and did not open it. Coleman objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Then Patricia introduced the journal. Dorothy explained how Eleanor had given her the lockbox quietly without ceremony in the last difficult months of her illness, and had asked her to keep it safe and open it only if it became necessary. She described the night she opened it alone at her kitchen table in Boone, after she had already begun to understand what had been done. Patricia held up the journal in its evidence sleeve. She turned to a specific page marked with a small tab and read aloud. The room was already quiet. It became quieter. "There is something wrong with this woman. She looks at Thomas's land the way a hawk looks at something small in a field below it. She is patient in a way that frightens me. She asks questions that sound like care but feel like inventory. Calvin looks at her the way a man looks at someone he is afraid to disappoint. I do not think he is a bad person. I think he is a weak one, and I think she knows exactly how to use that. I am afraid of what she will do when I am no longer here to see it." Patricia set the journal down. The silence in courtroom 4 had a texture to it, the specific quality of a room full of people who are not moving, because moving would interrupt something. I looked straight ahead at the middle distance between me and the bench, not at Dorothy, not at Calvin, not at the jury. I held my posture the way I had held it through every difficult session of my professional life, and I did not allow the room to see what Eleanor's words read aloud in a courtroom did to the part of me that had loved her for 40 years. I had known what was in the journal. George had read me the passage months ago. I had lived with those words long enough that they should have lost their capacity to reach me. They had not. Coleman's cross-examination of Dorothy was brief and by his standards restrained. He questioned the chain of custody for the journal. How could the court be certain the entries had not been made or altered after Eleanor's passing? Dorothy answered with the patience of a former school teacher explaining something to a student who was asked a question. They already know the answer to the journal had been in a locked box in her hall closet for nearly 2 years, and the handwriting had been verified by a document examiner whose report was already in the court record. Coleman sat down. George took the stand in the mid-afternoon. He had the financial record organized in the methodical way. He organized everything chronologically clearly labeled, with summaries that a layperson could follow without specialized knowledge. He walked Patricia through 7 months of transfers, amounts, dates, destination, accounts, and the paper trail he had reconstructed from banking records, corporate filings, and the work of a forensic accountant in Asheville whose name was already in evidence. The total was $83,400, moved out of the primary farm account in increments designed to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic bank review. Routed through 2 intermediate accounts, one registered to a shell entity in Delaware, one to a name that cross-referenced to a cousin of Serena's in another state. The end destination in both cases was an account held jointly by Calvin and Serena at a bank in Charlotte. Coleman's cross-examination went after the forensic methodology. George answered each challenge with the steady patience of a man who has done this work long enough to anticipate the questions and is not rattled by them. When George stepped down, Patricia stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to play a portion of an audio recording entered as Exhibit 22. The room waited. The recording began. Calvin's voice came through the courtroom speakers with the particular clarity of a close-range digital recording on a cold, quiet night. The words were unhurried, certain. "The forest has a way of making old men think clearly, Dad. You should take your time." 12 people in the jury box sat without moving. I sat without moving. The recording ran for 47 seconds in total, long enough to establish the location, the circumstances the document being presented, and the explicit statement of coercion. Patricia stopped it there. She did not need more. The afternoon session was approaching its scheduled end when Patricia's phone lit up on the table beside her. She glanced at it, and something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, but the way a person shifts when a variable they have been anticipating has just arrived. She requested a brief recess, conferred with her associate for 3 minutes in the hallway, and returned to request an adjournment to the following morning due to a development from the defense side that required overnight preparation. The judge granted it. I gathered my materials. Around me, the gallery began to move, voices picking up the room, returning to its ordinary human noise after the weight of the afternoon. As I passed the defense table, I glanced once, not deliberately, simply as a function of the path I was walking, and I noticed that Calvin was staring at the chair beside him. The chair where Serena had been sitting for the first 4 days of the trial. It was empty. She had been escorted out by her own attorney before the afternoon session ended quietly through the side door, while George's testimony was still in progress. I had registered it at the time and set it aside for later consideration. Calvin was still looking at the empty chair when I walked past. He did not look up. He did not look at me or at Coleman or at anyone in the room. He simply stared at the space where she had been. I kept walking. Patricia stood at 9:03 on the morning of the 7th day. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution wishes to inform the court that Serena Hargrove has entered into a cooperation agreement with this office. Her statement, provided under oath and subject to cross-examination, will be read into the record by the Assistant District Attorney." The room absorbed this the way rooms absorb unexpected information, not with noise, but with a particular quality of held breath. Coleman set his pen down. Calvin turned his head toward the table where Serena had sat for the first 4 days of the trial, the reflex of a man looking for something that is no longer there. The assistant district attorney, a young woman in her 30s named Claire Abbott, stood at the lectern with a document of 14 pages and read it in the steady, unaffected voice of someone delivering testimony rather than performing it. She read for 31 minutes. The statement was detailed and specific. It described the plan from its earliest stages, the conversations between Calvin and Serena in late 2022, before they had even approached me about returning to the farm. It named who had proposed each step, the temporary financial authorization, the management of my schedule, the introduction of a substance into my morning routine designed to produce the appearance of cognitive decline. Serena's statement identified herself as the architect of the strategy and Calvin as the primary instrument of it. She was precise about the distinction. Coleman did not object during the reading. There was nothing productive to object to. When Claire Abbott finished and sat down, the room was quiet in a way that felt like the quiet after a door closes rather than the quiet before one opens. There was one portion of Serena's statement that I had not been told about in advance. Patricia had warned me that the statement contained material I might find difficult. I had assumed she meant the documentation of specific acts, the transfers, the planning, the calculated methodology of it. I was not prepared for what she had actually meant. Serena described the night after Calvin left me in the forest. She described him returning to the farmhouse at approximately 12:30 in the morning. She described his condition, agitated, unable to settle, moving through the house without purpose, in the way a person moves when they cannot locate stillness. By 2 o'clock, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey he had barely touched. She had come downstairs at 2:45 to find him still there. She described hearing him, not words initially, just the sound of a man who had exhausted whatever he had been running on and had nothing left to run on. And then words quiet enough that she almost didn't catch them. "He'll be okay. He's always okay," said not to her, said to the kitchen or to the dark outside the window or to no one, the way a person says something they need to be true, badly enough that saying it out loud feels like making it more so. Claire Abbott read this passage in the same steady voice she had used for everything else. She did not inflect it. She did not need to. I sat at the complainant's table, and looked at the middle distance and understood for the first time something I had only half understood on the night it happened. When Calvin put the truck in drive and pulled away down that forestry road, there had been a gap not long, perhaps 30 or 40 seconds between the moment the door closed and the moment the engine engaged. I had registered it in the dark and not known what to make of it. Now I knew. He had sat in that truck with both hands on the wheel, and he had not moved for 30 or 40 seconds. And then he had driven away. I looked at nothing in particular, and I held that information for a moment. It did not change what had happened. It did not alter the 4 charges, the months of evidence, the systematic dismantling of my autonomy and my relationships that had been the structure of the past year. But it was a piece of the full picture, and I was a man who had spent his life believing that the full picture mattered even when some parts of it were harder to carry than others. Calvin had turned to look at Serena's side of the room when the passage was read. She was not there to look back at him. He turned forward again after a moment, and I watched his jaw set in the way it had set. The night in the forest, the same expression, the same controlled surface over whatever was moving underneath it. But his eyes, when he looked toward the front of the room, had a quality I had not seen in them during the trial. Not anger, something more like a man looking at a distance he did not know how to cross. The jury was sent to deliberate at 11:45. They returned at 2:15. The foreperson, the retired postal worker from the front row, a man of about 60 with a deliberate way of speaking, read each count in sequence. The word came 4 times evenly spaced without drama. Guilty, 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 guilty. Sentencing was immediate per the agreement Patricia had negotiated with the court. Serena received 3 years of supervised probation and full financial restitution. The cooperation agreement had secured her, the reduction she had calculated on. Calvin received 6 years in a federal correctional facility. The judge's words during sentencing were measured and without excess. She described the nature of the offenses, the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable adult, the sustained manipulation of financial and medical systems, the erosion of trust within a family. She said what needed to be said and did not add to it. 2 officers came to the defense table when the session closed. Calvin stood. He allowed his hands to be positioned for the restraints with the resigned compliance of a man who had accepted finally the shape of the ground beneath him. And then he turned. The officers had him moving toward the side exit when he stopped. Not a struggle, just a pause, a brief and specific stillness. He turned his head and found me where I was standing near the complainant's table, still gathering my materials, and he looked at me the way I had looked at him in that forestry road directly, without deflection, without anything between the looking and the being looked at. He said 2 words, quietly, low enough that I doubt anyone beyond the immediate space heard them. "I'm sorry, Dad." Then the officers moved, and he moved with them, and the door to the side corridor opened and closed, and he was gone. I stood at the table with my folder in my hands. I did not answer him, not because I had nothing to say, but because what I had to say was not something that belonged in a courtroom in that moment, with officers present and a gallery beginning to move around me. What I had was something larger than the occasion could hold. The 2 words I had waited for had arrived too late and right on time simultaneously in the way that the things we wait for sometimes do. I stood there for a moment longer. Then I picked up my things and walked out into the February afternoon. The February light outside the courthouse was cold and exact. That is the particular quality of winter light in the Carolina mountains. It does not soften things the way spring and summer light does. It simply illuminates them plainly at whatever angle it finds them. Standing on the courthouse steps with my folder under my arm, I felt it on my face and thought that there was something appropriate about that. Dorothy was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She did not say anything when I came down. She took my free hand in both of hers and held it for a moment. Not a hug, not a formal gesture. Just the particular pressure of a person who has been through something with you and wants you to know they are still there. I squeezed back once. That was sufficient. George stood a few feet away, looking out at the parking lot, with his hands in his coat pockets, giving us the space the moment required. He had the composure of a man who understands when to be present without being intrusive, a quality I had valued in him for 35 years, and valued more in that moment than I knew how to say. 3 reporters had assembled near the bottom of the steps. They moved toward us when I appeared. George stepped forward before they reached us, not confrontationally, simply positioning himself in the way of the most direct approach, and said something brief and quiet. By the time I had descended the last step, they had reconsidered. The 3 of us walked to the parking lot without being followed. I looked back once before we reached George's truck at the courthouse building. The stone facade, the windows of the upper floors. Courtroom 4 was on the 2nd floor, northeast corner. I could identify the windows from outside, from 34 years of knowing the building's interior. I had walked out of that courthouse after a great many sessions over the years. I had always been the last one to leave, the last to gather materials, the last to check that the room was in order, the last to let the door close behind me. Today I had walked out in the middle of the afternoon, with the building still occupied, the lights still on other people's proceedings still underway. It was a different kind of leaving. The weeks that followed had a quality I had not anticipated, not relief exactly, and not emptiness. More like the specific stillness of a house after a long noise has finally stopped, when you are not yet certain whether the quiet is permanent or only a pause. I returned to the farm alone. The land was still there, the 400 acres of red clay and longleaf pine that my grandfather had broken ground on before my father was born, that my father had passed to me, that I had tended for 40 years alongside Eleanor. The cattle operation needed attention. The south pasture needed the fence work that had been deferred through the months of the trial. The equipment barn roof, which Dorothy and I had agreed needed addressing before winter, had made it through without incident, but would not make it through another season without repair. I worked. It was the right thing to do. The farm had always been the right thing to do when thinking needed to be done, alongside something physical. On a Saturday in early March, I began clearing the rooms Calvin and Serena had occupied. I did this alone, and deliberately moving through the space with the methodical care of a person who is performing a task that requires both attention and a certain amount of steadiness. Their belongings had been removed by that point taken by others in the weeks before the trial. What remained were the small residual traces that a room retains after it has been lived in a shelf configuration adjusted to different preferences, a window latch that had been set differently, the particular arrangement of the furniture that someone else had established. I worked through the morning, at some point in the late morning moving items from the closet shelf to assess what needed storing. I dislodged something from the back of the upper shelf, a piece of paper folded. That had been sitting there undisturbed long enough to have gathered a fine film of dust along its upper edge. I unfolded it at the foot of the bed. The crayon lines were faded but legible, the oversized circle hands, the straight line arms, the 2 figures standing side by side. Above them, in the careful capital letters of a child who had recently learned how to make them. Me and Dad, just as heroes. I sat down on the floor where I was standing. Not because my legs gave out, because the moment required sitting, and the floor was there, and I sat. I held the paper with both hands, and I looked at it for a long time. Not thinking about anything in particular, not analyzing or processing or arriving at conclusions. Just looking at what a boy of 8 had made one Tuesday morning, 32 years ago, before anything that had happened, since it happened. I was still sitting there when I heard Dorothy's truck on the gravel. She came in through the back the way she always had, calling out when she heard no answer at the door. She found me in the room, still on the floor, and she sat down beside me without asking for an explanation, the way a person sits when the explanation is visible and additional words would be an imposition. We stayed there for a few minutes. Then I got up and she got up and we went downstairs and I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the March fields together. The conversation we had was quiet and uneven in the way of conversations between people who have been through something together and are finding their way back to the ordinary register of sibling life. We talked about the barn roof. We talked about a book she was reading. At some point she mentioned that she had been thinking about coming down on alternate weekends for a while, if I didn't object. I said I didn't object. She left before dark, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched her taillights move down the long drive. That evening, I found a composition notebook on the shelf in the study, the last of the supply I had kept there for years, all the others having been used in the months of evidence gathering. I took it to the kitchen table and opened it to the first page. I had never kept a journal. I had kept case notes, correspondence, records of various kinds. Not a journal. I wrote for an hour. I wrote about Eleanor specific things, small things, the kind of details that a person forgets they are holding until they sit down and discover the inventory. I wrote about Calvin at 16 in the back row of my courtroom. I wrote about one night in December, standing alone in a pine forest with my hand on a watch, not afraid. Near the bottom of the page, I wrote a question. Not because I expected an answer, but because it had been sitting in me since the February afternoon I walked out of the courthouse and it needed to be placed somewhere outside myself. When does a father stop being a father? I sat with it. Then I wrote below it in the same unhurried hand. Never. I closed the notebook and turned off the kitchen light and stood at the window for a while. Outside, the season's first snow had begun. Not heavy, just the tentative early fall of it, drifting down through the dark over the fields. In the morning, it would be gone most likely, but it was there now, covering the January bare ground in something temporary and quiet. Somewhere 200 miles from where I was standing, Calvin was spending his first night in a federal correctional facility. I did not know what the accommodations were. I did not know whether the blankets were adequate for the time of year. I found that I hoped they were. I could not stop myself from hoping that. And standing at the window in the first snow of March, looking out over the fields that had belonged to my family for 3 generations, I was not entirely sure I wanted to. September came in, the way it always does in the Carolina mountains, quietly without announcement. The light shifting from the flat brightness of August into something deeper and more considered. The mornings carried a chill that the afternoons burned off by noon, and the fields had the particular gold green of late summer turning. The color that means the season knows what's coming, even if it isn't ready yet. George came on a Saturday afternoon, and we sat on the front porch the way we had sat on porches together for 35 years, with coffee without agenda, watching the light move across the south pasture. The barn roof had been repaired in June. The south fence was solid. The cattle operation was running on a rhythm that felt for the first time in more than a year, like something I had chosen rather than something I was merely maintaining. We talked about small things for a while. A case George had been consulted on, remotely nothing serious, a property dispute in Buncombe County that needed a clear set of eyes. The state of the county commission, whether the diner and Marshall had finally gotten a decent pie. Then George set his mug on the porch rail and looked out at the pasture and said without preamble the thing he had been waiting for the right moment to say. "You going to write to him?" I had been thinking about it since March. Not obsessively, not the way I had thought about the evidence, the trial, the architecture of what needed to be built and then executed. More, the way you think about something that you know is waiting for you at a particular distance. And the only question is whether you have closed enough of that distance yet to make the attempt meaningful. 6 months had passed since the February verdict. I had spoken to Patricia twice, once about the restitution process, once about a procedural matter that needed my signature. I had received a letter from Dr. Marsh in April, brief and warm, saying that his father's name had been spoken in a courtroom and that he believed something had been completed that needed completing. I had written back. I had not written to Calvin. Soon, I told George. I looked out at the same stretch of pasture he was looking at, the light going amber in the late afternoon. "I think I'm nearly ready." George nodded once. He finished his coffee and stood up, with the deliberateness of a man whose knees register the change of seasons before the calendar does. He shook my hand at the top of the porch steps, not the casual parting gesture of people who expect to see each other shortly, but the kind of handshake that acknowledges something has been shared and continues to be shared, without requiring the acknowledgement to be spoken. He drove out at 4:30. I watched the truck reach the end of the drive and turn onto the county road, and then I stood on the porch alone for a while, with the last of my coffee going cool in the mug. I thought about what I had learned, not the events those I knew, with the precision of a man who had written them down and lived through them and watched their consequences unfold in a courtroom. What I had learned was something more difficult to locate and more resistant to being organized on a page. Something about the relationship between two things I had spent my career treating as related but distinct. The law punishes conduct. That is what it does, and what it is designed to do. And in the right hands, it does that work with a justice I continue to believe in. I had watched it work imperfectly slowly with all the friction of a human institution, but genuinely over 30 years in more cases than I could number. But the law cannot restore what it did not damage. It cannot return a boy to the man that boy became, or give back the decades between a crayon drawing and a courtroom, or undo the particular grief of a father who sat across from his son and watched a jury deliver the verdict both of them had made inevitable. The farm was mine again. The accounts were cleared. The legal apparatus had done what legal apparatus does, and it had done it correctly. What the law had not returned, what no sentence could have returned, was the boy who drew that picture. Mourning him was something I would have to do on my own schedule and my own time, without any institutional framework to give it structure. That was not a failure of the system. That was simply the limit of what any system can do. Healing is not in the verdict. It lives somewhere further down the road in territory the law cannot enter. I went inside when the light began to go. The study was quiet, the late afternoon kind of quiet that has settled in, rather than arrive the kind you don't notice until you stop moving. I sat at the desk and took a sheet of paper from the center drawer, the good paper, the kind I use for correspondence that mattered. I placed it on the desk in front of me. Then I reached to the left side of the desk and picked up the watch. Eleanor's watch. I had worn it on my wrist every day for 34 years, through every proceeding, every verdict, every walk through a courthouse parking lot. I had carried it into a pine forest on a December night and held my thumb against its worn edge while I waited for headlights. I had held it in both hands in a hotel room at 3 a.m, while George and Dorothy worked through documents 2 counties away. I set it on the desk beside the paper, not on my wrist. Beside me the way you place something near you when you want the presence of it without the weight. I picked up the pen. I thought about a boy of 8 with a red crayon and a blue one making something at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before his father left for the courthouse. I thought about a teenager sitting in the back row of a courtroom with a spiral notebook taking notes on a life he intended to build. I thought about 2 quiet words spoken in a courtroom corridor at the end of February, low enough that only I could hear them. I thought about 32 minutes in a pine forest looking up through the gap in the trees at a cold December sky. About the 30 or 40 seconds before the truck engine engaged and the taillights moved away down the road. About a man sitting alone at a kitchen table at 3 a.m, saying something to the dark that he needed to be true. I touched the pen to the paper. Dear Calvin. I stopped. Outside the study window, the September light was going gold on the tree line at the far edge of the south pasture. Those trees had been saplings when Calvin was 9 years old, a Saturday in early spring, when I had rented a small auger and marked out the positions and the 2 of us had worked down the fence. Lined together Calvin in rubber boots 2 sizes too large that he had refused to exchange for a smaller pair, because he intended, he said, to grow into them. We had planted 23 trees that afternoon. 19 of them had survived. They were 40 feet tall now. I looked at them for a while. The pen rested in my hand against the paper, the ink just touching the edge of the letters I had written. The light was changing as I watched the way September light changes in the late afternoon, slowly, and then all at once. I do not know what I will write after that opening. I do not know if he will write back. I do not know whether we will ever stand together on this porch again, in some autumn that has not yet arrived, watching the same fields from the same railing. But I know this, I spent 30 years believing in the capacity of justice. I am not ready to stop believing in the capacity of forgiveness. Not yet, not today. But I am closer than I was yesterday. And for now, sitting at a desk in September, with Eleanor's watch beside me and a letter I have only just begun, and 19 trees standing at the far edge of a field that has belonged to my family for 3 generations. For now, that is enough. I am not going to tell you my story was exceptional. Every family carries weight, and most carry a version of this somewhere inside the trust extended too far. The moment when love and judgment pointed in opposite directions, and the person who paid the price for choosing love. I share this family story not because I believe my suffering was greater than yours, but because I believe what came out of it might be useful to someone sitting where I once sat. So here is what I would tell you, plainly. Do not do what I did. Do not let loneliness make your decisions. Do not sign documents because you are tired of eating alone. Do not confuse someone's return with someone's redemption. I was a man who spent 3 decades reading people for a living, and I still let grief make me careless. If it can happen to me, understand that it can happen to anyone. Family betrayal does not always arrive as an enemy. It arrives wearing a familiar face, carrying flowers, saying the things you have been waiting to hear. That is precisely what makes family betrayal so difficult to name and so important to recognize before the cost of recognition becomes too high. Watch your finances, keep your own counsel, maintain the relationships that were there before the new arrival. And if something feels wrong, trust that feeling the way you would trust any evidence because it is evidence. I believe, and I have believed this since, before I sat on any bench, that God places people in our lives at specific moments for reasons that are not always immediately legible. Doctor, Marsh did not find me by accident. Dorothy did not hold that journal by accident. George did not answer on the second ring by accident. When I was most alone, I was not in fact abandoned. That is the part of this family story that I return to most often. Family betrayal leaves a mark. I will not pretend otherwise, but it does not have to leave the final word. The letter on my desk still begins, Dear Calvin, and nothing more. Perhaps it will for a while yet. Forgiveness is not a decision you make once. It is a direction you choose to keep moving in one day at a time without any guarantee of arrival. That is where I am, moving. Thank you for staying with me through every part of this. If you found yourself in Thomas's position, facing that moment when trust collapsed and the road forward was unclear, I'd genuinely like to know what you would have done. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this family story meant something to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A note: while this story draws from real emotional truths and social themes, certain elements have been shaped for narrative purposes. If this style of storytelling isn't your preference, there's plenty more on this channel. Find what speaks to you.